Good morning. Thank you so much for coming. Oh, there we go. To our seminar today, my name is Patty Haskell, and I am on the CBTA board in charge of seminars and events. So this is our first one since COVID. I had our speakers here set up to come in 2020, and that didn't work. And 2021 didn't work, but we're here in 2022. So thank you so much. So I am pleased to present Wendy Baxter and Ambrose, who are here for our presentation today. Thank you so much. Oh, and if you have any questions, why don't you wait till the end? It will just make it flow easier. Thank you.
Cool. Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting us, and it's great to be here to talk about science and conservation of giant sequoias in a rapidly changing world. As Patty mentioned, I'm Anthony Ambrose, and that's Wendy Baxter, my wife and partner. We are with the Marmot Society. It's great to be back here. We have done a lot of research in the South Calaveras Grove, starting back around 2010. We were involved in an effort to put a permanent research plot there, and so we love this forest. So it's great to be back. So we were formerly at UC Berkeley when we first started work in the giant sequoias. We've been working in the sequoias for almost 2 decades now. Most of that research was at UC Berkeley, but in 2020, we left Berkeley and formed our own nonprofit organization called the Marmot Society. We're based out of South Lake Tahoe. We're a nonprofit forest research, outreach, education organization. And our first project that we started as the Marmot Society is in the giant sequoias. And we'll be talking about the work that we're doing as part of this presentation. You might be wondering why the Marmot Society. We were inspired by the marmots who we fell in love with while working in giant forest in Sequoia National Park. They would be hanging out when we were working in the trees, and we just absolutely adore them, and they kind of represented like the sentinels of the forest for us. And so we took that inspiration and named our organization after them. So just a brief overview of the presentation that we're going to be giving today. The first is going to be just a brief introduction to climate change and hotter drought, which is the larger context for everything that we're doing now and the challenges that giant sequoias are facing now. And then we're going to be talking about kind of these 4 novel threats to giant sequoias, trees and forests. The direct effects of drought stress, a new novel emerging threat from bark beetle attack, large, severe wildfires, and then potentially regeneration failure in certain areas that we're starting to get concerned about. And then we're going to wrap it up with a little discussion about a newly formed Giant Sequoia Lands Coalition, which Calaveras Big Tree State Park is a part of. And there was just in February the first meeting and science symposium of the Lands Coalition. And the presentation that we're going to be giving today is based off of kind of a summary and synthesis of some of the work that was presented at that symposium by our colleagues as part of the coalition. We're presenting some of our work as well as some of other people's work from the USGS, as well as the Nature Conservancy and the Park Service, and our collaborators as part of this whole process. So this is kind of a synthesis of not only our work, but others as well. So 2012 to 2016 was one of the hottest, driest periods in the historical record in California. This figure is showing the Palmer Drought Severity Index. So as you go below 0, this kind of index of 0, the further down you go, the worse the drought is. And this is from a paper from Park Williams and colleagues in 2015, where they tried to look at the effect of anthropogenic climate change on this drought severity index. And this blue line here, which is superimposed by the orange line there, and this dashed line, you can see that over time, there's obviously certain drought periods. This is the 2012 to 2016 period right here. If you just take into consideration precipitation and water input into the system, then the 2014 period is not quite as severe as what was identified in 1924. You can see this goes slightly below this line here. But as temperatures are continuing to increase and conditions are getting hotter, that affects the demand side of drought. There's both the supply side, which is what's coming into the system from rain and snow, and then there's the demand side, which is primarily driven from temperature, which affects the vapor pressure deficit, which is the aridity or dryness of the atmosphere that's sucking water out of the soil, out of the trees. And so this modeling that they did in this paper that was published in 2015, they looked at that effect of a temperature effect and a drying effect, and actually that effect made the drought much more severe in 2014 than even going back to 1900. So this is a preview to the future. It's something that is going to be increasingly important to consider as we move forward. Greg Asner's lab with Carnegie Airborne Observatory, then at Stanford, and he's now at Arizona State, published a paper in 2016 where they have this airborne observatory that has hyperspectral and LiDAR sensors, and they mapped out the entire state. They flew over the entire state with these sensors in their plane and came up with this canopy water content index. And so blue is relatively high water content in the forest, and the further yellow, orange, red that you get, the drier the canopy is. And you can see, ringing around the Central Valley and the kind of more the lower elevation foothills, and getting up to this elevation was actually quite severe drought during that time period in 2015 when they flew at higher elevations, and further north tended to be wetter and less drought stress compared to further south. And the Southern Sierra was really dry at that point. And the Forest Service did some aerial surveys of the state and national forests primarily, and they estimated more than 100 million trees died from 2014 to 2017. Here's a photo looking at right next to Giant Forest in Sequoia National Park, and you can see all of these brown trees. This was taken in around 2015. Mostly pines, firs, and cedars died. This number, I don't have the latest number, but I'm certain that the number of trees has increased since then. And things are not getting any better. That 2012 to 2016 was a very severe drought period, but that is within the context of a larger, what is now being termed mega drought. And the new paper just this year by Park Williams follow-up, they looked at the historical record of tree rings and came up with drought index, and they created these maps, and again compared what observed drought conditions are compared to what they would be without climate change and that temperature drying effect. And it found that the 22-year period from 2000 to 2021 ranks amongst the second to the fifth most severe in the last 1,200 years. And so, there was a brief reprieve in 2017 and 18, but now it's been actually accelerating the last several years. We're in the third year now going into even more severe drought. And most of the giant sequoia range, it varies from landscape or from site to site, but most of the giant sequoia range is in this really severe drought period. And the future doesn't look any better unless we deal with climate change. This is some projected temperature change from towards the end of this century compared to a baseline from 1961 to 1990, and you can see up to 4 degrees Fahrenheit increase primarily. You can see on the kind of the eastern side of the state, the coast is a little bit more moderated from that ocean influence, but this doesn't bode well for the giant sequoias, which are in that really red zone. And right now we have, this is as of a few days ago, the U.S. drought monitor, where most of the state is in extreme or severe drought, including most of the giant sequoia range. So this is where we're at now, and as I'm sure you're aware, the snowpack this season has been erratic, but is very low. And giant sequoias really rely on that snowpack for their summer moisture supply. It's a critical supply for them to provide water to these trees through the dry summer season. And right now, the snow water equivalent is, in the kind of the central and southern Sierra, between 20 and 40% of normal for this date. These last storms in the last couple of weeks have actually helped that. It was a lot lower actually just a few weeks ago. There was that big heat wave, so that provided a little bit of a reprieve from this nice April late season storms, but we're still in a really severe drought season. So the first kind of novel threat that we would like to talk about today is kind of the direct effects of drought stress on giant sequoia trees. This photo was taken in 2015 in giant forests, and you can see the severe mortality of these pines and firs and cedars in the kind of the mixed elevation, the mixed conifer zone a little bit lower. This is a giant sequoia tree showing some foliage dieback. And our colleague Nate Stevenson with the USGS went out and in 2014, and he wanted to see what the effects of the drought were having on the sequoia trees. He was primarily concerned about seedlings when he went out looking around the forest, but didn't really see any noticeable observed impacts on the seedlings. But when he looked up into the trees, he noticed there was an unusual and unprecedented level of foliage dieback in some of the trees. Not all trees, most of them kind of had low to medium dieback, but there was a certain percent that had this really high level of dieback. And this was kind of an unusual phenomenon. Every year foliage turns over in giant sequoia trees, and most plants, they shed older foliage and grow new foliage every year, but this was something entirely different. And Nate looked through the kind of the historical records and notes of past park superintendents and park rangers and such, and nobody had ever recorded anything like this before, and so it was quite alarming and unusual. So in 2015, we joined a team and our colleagues with the USGS, led by Nate Stevenson, the Carnegie Airborne Observatory, and the National Park Service to start what we call the Giant Sequoia Leaf to Landscape project. And there was 3 main components to this project, aiming at trying to understand the mechanisms of the drought response of the giant sequoia trees, and mapping out the vulnerability of the trees to drought and where they were experiencing the most stress. And so there were 3 components. The Carnegie group was flying over the whole landscape where we were studying in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks with the remote sensing sensors from their plane. The USGS was responsible for walking along the trail network and mapping out the tree foliage dieback patterns. And our team at UC Berkeley, Wendy and I and some other colleagues, working on the leaf chemistry and physiology to try and get at what's going on with these trees and linking up all 3 of these components to get a better understanding of the drought response and spatial patterns of their response. So we published a series of papers in 2018, a special issue that had 5 different papers from this effort, but I'm just going to summarize some of the results that we came up with from that effort. So we came up with this kind of tree drought response framework of how the giant sequoia trees were responding. So at the top of the page here is kind of mild drought stress, and as you go down towards the bottom, you have increasing levels of stress. So at kind of mild drought stress levels, giant sequoia trees have these leaf level adjustments that they make. They close their stomata, the little tiny pores in their leaves, to conserve water. They have increased water storage, and they build tougher, more drought-resistant foliage. And so these are kind of under mild drought conditions. These are going to be enough for the tree to compensate and adjust to those drought conditions. But as the drought stress increases, we found, and what happened in 2014, primarily 2015 a little bit, was this canopy level adjustments. When those leaf level adjustments are not sufficient to conserve enough water and prevent severe hydraulic damage, the ability of the tree to transport water up from the roots up through the trunk and out the leaves, then they shed their foliage. It's a very good strategy. They just kind of shed their foliage to reduce the amount of transpiring leaf area that's losing water to the atmosphere. And then if that drought stress continues to increase, then you can get to a point of mortality, hydraulic failure, and what we think happens is interactions with fire damage and biotic agents that is interacting with the drought stress to actually kill the trees. We didn't see any mortality in 2014, 2015 when we started this work, but we'll talk a little bit more about that and where we're at now later in the presentation. So in summary, so after the rains came and we had a good winter in 2017, 2018, the sequoias recovered from the dieback with no known deaths at that point. Their drier sites had the most dieback. Wetter sites have little or none. And you can see this image here is from the Airborne Observatory. They highlighted all the giant sequoias they were able to identify with remote sensing. This is giant forest here, kind of the plateau. And the color coding indicates the relative level of canopy water content. So the blue is high water content, and the yellow, orange, red is the lower water content. So we were able to identify these areas that had most dieback, and there was a correlation between the water content and the dieback. And foliage dieback was a very smart way for sequoias to conserve water and manage the stress. They kind of just shed their foliage and hunker down. There is a carbon cost to that because the foliage that they shed is the photosynthetic organs that are fixing carbon from the atmosphere and providing the carbon to the trees for growth and metabolism. So there's an impact to that, but in order to avoid hydraulic failure of the water transport system of the tree, that was a very smart way to deal with stress. And there was some success that we had with the vulnerability mapping. There was some imperfections and we need to refine that more, but there was a good first step. So the second threat that we want to talk about is this new emerging threat from bark beetles. And right towards the end of that drought period, we started to observe some of these trees. You can see this is from Giant Forest, from Nate Stevenson, showing these trees that started to die back, and that was quite alarming. Giant sequoias are considered to be very pest and pathogen resistant. The tannins in their bark and foliage and other chemicals are really effective at fighting off insects and pathogens. But towards the end of that study period, we started to find some branches on the ground, some sequoia branches like this, that had some obvious entry and exit holes from bark beetles. And they were under these trees that were starting to die back, and so we were like, well, maybe there's something going on here. So you don't know whether the bark beetles, we didn't know whether the bark beetles were attacking branches that had fallen out of the tree and were unable to defend themselves because they weren't attached to the tree anymore and were being attacked by the beetles, or whether the beetles were actually attacking living branches up in the crowns of these trees. So we climbed some trees that were showing this dieback pattern. Typically from the top down they started to die back. This is actually a dead tree that we climbed after the fact, and found evidence, in fact, beetle galleries in the bark, in the crowns of these trees. And we've climbed a number of trees over those from about 2017 through 2020, and found evidence that these beetles are actually attacking living branches in the giant sequoia trees, which hasn't been observed before. This is an image from the entomologist, a guy from Oregon State Parks that is helping us with the identification of these beetles. This is a Phlaiocynus, or western cedar bark beetle, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a bit. As of 2020, there's within Sequoia, Kings Canyon National Parks, where they've kind of been looking out for this, we found about 33 known dead monarchs that have the evidence that they were killed by this combination of drought, fire, and beetles. So what are the common characteristics of these trees? One is that they all have pretty severe fire damage, either from wildfire or prescribed fire, at the base of the trees. These are in relatively low severity fire areas. There's not a lot of crown scorch, if any, but the base has been somewhat girdled, which we think compromises its ability to transport water up into the crown. The second, and somewhat counterintuitive thing about these trees that have died is they are all in these kind of wet, moist spots, sites on the landscape, like the sides of meadows or creek sides, really kind of wet areas that you would think would be normally the least stressful parts of the landscape for these trees. But what we're finding is even with similar amounts of basal fire damage, trees that are kind of upland aren't dying back, but trees down by these wet spots are. So what's going on there? So we kind of had this hypothesis. Nate came up with this figure to kind of identify, the colors are a little off here, but yeah, sorry, the colors are off. But I'll walk you through this. So what's going on with wet site trees versus dry site trees? And why would they be more vulnerable? And we think it might be having something to do with their root systems. And so if you look at on the left side, there's the dry sites where there's some foliage dieback that we looked at. Oh man, the colors are off. Basically, this is unweathered bedrock. There's no soil water available there. This other zone here is blue is where the water is. I'm going to have to kind of skip ahead a little bit because the colors came off on this computer. The idea being, we know that giant sequoias don't like very wet roots. They don't like super saturated soils. Seedling experiments, potted plants, other observations of where giant sequoias grow, they don't really like really saturated soils. So in these very wet sites, where you have a higher water table, we think that they have shallower roots than in kind of these mesic or dry site conditions. And so that when there's a severe drought period, maybe that water table drops and it kind of leaves their shallow root system kind of high and dry. It's kind of the spoiled tree hypothesis is what we're calling it, is that something to do with where the trees are getting their water from makes these wet site trees more vulnerable to drought stress and subsequent beetle attack. So we know that giant sequoia trees need an enormous amount of water. This figure here shows a summary of global databases that we've managed to, we've collected from the literature. This x-axis is the sapwood area, the size of the trunk. The y-axis is daily water use of the trees, and you can see down on this lower left side of the figure from the literature, angiosperms and conifers that have been reported in the literature, there's this positive relationship between the size of the tree and how much water it needs. And so we've measured in a paper in 2016, we measured some trees, and in 2021 we followed up with some additional giant sequoia trees and found that they use in more than any other tree that's ever been reported in the literature, up to 4,000 liters or 1,000 gallons of water in a single summer day that flows through these trunks up through the tree. It's just a function of how much leaf area they have, that's transpiring water. So this is kind of their Achilles heel, because to support trees of this size, you really need to have a lot of water. And that's why they're found in areas that have relatively abundant water. By the way, this is a photo of Wendy in the South Calaveras Grove here. But it's actually kind of amazing that we really still don't have a good idea of where giant sequoias are getting their water, how deep their roots are. They're typically considered shallow rooted. We know that they have really wide roots. And from observations of tip overs like this is a tree in Mariposa Grove that fell within the last couple of years. You don't see any major big fat tap roots going really deep down. It's all this kind of fine roots. They have big lateral roots. So sequoias are typically considered to be shallow rooted. But looking at, we've done some kind of crude calculations of how much water a giant sequoia forest would need and how much water is available in the upper kind of 2 meters of soil. And it's not enough water in the soil to support the transpiration rates that we've measured in these trees over the whole summer growing season. So we think that they probably are getting their water from deeper soil layers that we're not necessarily aware of, some fine roots that are working their way down deeper than kind of this shallow soil layers that you see in this photo. And you would think that we know that giant sequoias, like in these kind of meadow sites, would probably have enough soil or enough water to support them. But what about these really big, gnarly trees that are growing on these rocky ridge tops? This is a tree, an amazing tree, and probably 2,000-3,000 year old tree in giant forest, growing on this rocky ridge top at the very edge of the grove. Where is it getting its water? And is it getting the same water as these trees that are growing in more of these kind of typically wet site conditions? And how does that influence their vulnerability? So in 2020, we started this collaborative project with the Park Service, Sequoia National Park primarily, and Yosemite as well, and USGS, and some other partners, what we call the Giant Sequoia Fire and Water Project. And the primary question that we're asking in this project is, how does fire affect giant sequoia tree water use? And how does that influence their vulnerability to drought and possible beetle attack? So we started it in giant forests in Sequoia National Park and Mariposa Grove in Yosemite. We have 65 study trees that we've been studying. We selected trees in wet and dry and kind of intermediate mesic sites. So kind of like on the left is kind of some creekside trees in giant forest, and then here's a ridgetop tree at the edge of the grove, the Mariposa Grove, that are some of our study sites, or study trees. And we're looking at both tree water sources and looking at tree water use patterns. So we're using the stable isotopes of the water, the hydrogen and oxygen stable isotopes, to trace where the trees are getting their water from. And so to do that, we're collecting tree xylem water. We're climbing these trees up to 10 meters. We found that, and what we do is we collect some cores. Like normally we use what are called increment borers that you would normally use to look at tree rings, where you screw this thing into the tree and extract a little pencil thin core out of it. What we do is, instead of looking at the tree rings, we just collect that core and then extract the water out of it. We suck the water out of this cryogenic vacuum distillation process in the lab, and then analyze the stable isotopes in the water of the tree. We have to climb these trees up to 10 meters rather than just collecting cores and extracting the water out of the wood at ground level, because we found that when we core into these giant sequoia trees at the ground level, oftentimes, almost all the time, it ends up weeping water out of the holes. That sometimes it gushes water, like in a water fountain. It can persist for months or even longer. And so there's some internal reservoir in the base of these trees that when you punch a hole into the base, it leaks out. And so in order to avoid that, we found you climb up about 10 meters and you don't get that same effect. So it's a lot of extra work to do that, but we don't want to hurt these trees, and so we're collecting the tree's island water, we're collecting source water, we have these precipitation buckets that are collecting snow and rain, and we're also collecting soil water from different depths. This is Breezy Jackson. She's the Yosemite Field Station Director for the UC Natural Reserve System. She's been our field assistant there, and that's Rob Goldfarb down in Yosemite, or Sequoia, that's helping us with soil water sampling and precipitation sampling. And what we can then do is use these mixing models to compare the stable isotope signature of what's in the trees with different sources of what's coming into the system, rain and snow, and then soil water. We're also collecting stream water, groundwater, spring water to see, and then you can compare and develop a kind of a relative proportion of water sources for the trees and where they're getting their water and how that changes over time and landscape position. And the last thing that we're doing right now is we've installed these little sap flow sensors. You can see this is at the top of one of our study trees in Giant Forest. We have these data loggers, these solar powered systems, and then we drill tiny little holes into the tree and put these little probes in, and we measure how much water is moving through the trunk. Every 10 minutes, these data loggers are measuring and recording that. And we also have some treetop weather stations that are monitoring environmental conditions. And so we can see real-time water use patterns of these trees. And we're doing this study in areas that are planned for prescribed fire, both in Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks. So we're collecting samples before and after fire, so we can compare and evaluate what the effects of fire are on their water sourcing and where they're getting their water from, as well as water use patterns. Unfortunately, both parks wanted to burn the last year, but conditions didn't allow. Wildfires, as you know, in the state have really put a constraint on the ability of the parks to have the right conditions where they felt comfortable burning. We're optimistic, and they're going to make every effort to burn this year. So we're going to continue this study until after they burn. So, going to get into a little bit of nitty-gritty on the stable isotopes and sap flow. Just some preliminary results. We're still processing samples, analyzing data, but just wanted to share a few little things with you about what we're finding. These two graphs are, the top one is the hydrogen isotope, and the bottom figure there on the left is the oxygen isotope. And as you go down from the top to the bottom of each graph is going down the depth of the soil. And you can see there's this evaporative enrichment of the isotopes as you get towards the surface, and then it declines as you get down. So this can tell us a little bit about when we compare where the tree isotopic signatures with these. So we can say, oh, is it getting more shallow or deeper soil water? And what we're finding when you plot out the oxygen and the hydrogen in this dual isotope space, these are all of our study trees in both Mariposa and Giant Forest. This is the isotopic space that they occupy, and then these symbols here are the soil water samples at different depths, and these lighter color symbols from the soil is the shallower soil, and then deeper down you get down here. So what this is showing is that all of this is giant sequoia trees. There is a little bit of spatial variation here in the dual isotope space between wet and dry and mesic site trees, but they're all generally getting this deeper soil water compared to the very shallow soil. At least in July of 2020, it's the only data that we have right now. COVID really hampered our ability to analyze our samples early on, but now we're starting and getting some more data. This is another figure showing the different site trees from July 2020, October 2020, and then May of 2021. And there's just a few things that I want to highlight this. So wet site trees tend to get deeper water. They're further down towards the lower left. But there is significant overlap in the water sources amongst the different trees that we're studying. And there is some evidence that there is some seasonal shifts in water sources from like dry summer of 2020 to the wet spring. So they are getting different sources of water through the seasons, but there is substantial overlap between the trees. And so this is still in the very preliminary stages, but we're excited about these data and continuing to process and analyze more and do the actual statistical analyses to quantify the relative proportions and how this changes over time and amongst the different sites. So this is a series of 4 panels showing a time series from when we first installed these sap flow and microclimate monitoring systems in October of 2020 and then going through October of 2021. This top panel is showing the time series of solar radiation, which is this kind of the black-gray lines, and you see these peaks and the solar peak in the summer and then dropping down in the fall. Vapor pressure deficit, that red line, is the aridity of the air. This panel here is showing the 8 different sap flow trees that we are monitoring and the daily peaks and patterns and over time of those different trees. This is showing precipitation that we measured from the rain gauges, and then this lower panel is showing the relative humidity and air temperature over that time period. And there's just a few things that we want to point out with these figures. One is what's really cool, just as an anecdote, is we found the first evidence of foliar uptake in giant sequoia trees. We knew that coast redwoods absorb water directly through their foliage, like from fog condensing on their foliage. We suspected that giant sequoias did as well, but we found during these wet periods, these rainstorms and such, you can see the sap flow when it goes below this 0 line. So these periods here where it's down below during wet periods, that is indicating reverse sap flow. So water is actually getting absorbed through the foliage and going back down the trunk as opposed to up the trunk and out the foliage. So that's a cool thing. We still need to evaluate the importance of that in terms of the physiology and water stress levels of the trees, but that's a cool, important subsidy that at least we found in coast redwoods, and that could be important for the giant sequoia trees as well. Another thing to note is there's these several heat waves. You can see high temperatures, high vapor pressure deficits, and some spikes in VPD, like in the middle of June of 2021, where you get this nighttime transpiration. So, every day the sap flow, the transpiration rates of these trees goes up and then drops down at night when the sun goes down and temperatures generally go down. But during these heat waves, we're finding that the trees are losing water throughout the day. They're not going back down to 0 or negative in the case of foliar uptake. So that has a potentially really significant impact on the water stress of these trees. And one thing to note is the general decline in the peak sap flow rates from 2020 in the fall of October when we first installed the system. The peak rates were fairly high, but the entire summer as the drought progressed in 2021, even the peak rates in this period here, and particularly early in the season after the rains and before it gets too dry, should be even higher than that, but we never saw it. So as the drought has been progressing, the trees are shutting down their stomata and conserving water. So these are 2 periods of the sap flow from the different 8 trees that we're monitoring here in Giant Forest, comparing the fall 2020 to summer 2021, and you can see these kind of daily peaks of the sap flow as the sun rises and temperatures increase, and the water use increases and then drops down at night. When we started plotting out these data, we started to look at the individual tree behavior. And what we noticed is the dry site trees are typically generally lower, particularly in the fall of 2020, than the wet site trees. But what was interesting is the difference between, you have two meadowside trees that we were monitoring and two creekside trees, and those are the green and the blue lines. And in the fall of 2020, the green lines were higher than the red lines, the dry site trees, and kind of consistent with the creekside trees. But what we found by summer of 2021 here in June, that the meadowside trees actually declined, and the relative proportion of the relative peaks of the wet site trees went down more than the dry site trees. So they had higher peak rates when conditions are good, but their peak rates went down more compared to the dry site trees. And the green site, the meadowside trees, actually went and declined even more. So they were even actually, this is indicating a greater level of stress than the creekside trees. So one kind of take-home message from this is that not all wet or dry site trees have the same hydrology and water availability and response to drought. Potentially, we need to do some more analyses, and we're still continuing these measurements, but potentially, meadowside trees might actually be more vulnerable to drought because their conditions might dry out more than the creekside trees faster. And one of these trees that the lowest meadowside tree that declined the most was this particular tree here. You can see me climbing here in this meadow. Anecdotally, when we first started the study in 2020, this whole meadow was very lush and had a lot of wet, kind of spongy, wet soils. It was very moist. But when we went back in 2021, it was really crispy dry, and the grasses and the wet site foliage growing in the understory was not nearly as prevalent in 2021, or as in 2020. And so, that's showing that there is some drying effect there going on. And the dry site trees are also not homogeneous. And, these giant sequoia trees are incredible at mining water and finding water. You think that, these trees that can live 1, 2, 3,000 years have a lot of time to find those water sources underground. And this is a tree in giant forest, one of our study trees that's up on this rocky ridge line. This is the very edge of the sequoia distribution in giant forest. Anything further upslope, there's no sequoias. It's all just pines and firs. But what's interesting is upslope here, right here, this arrow is showing this big root from the sequoia. It's got to come from this tree because there's no other sequoias right near here. So they're sending roots uphill in crazy places, which is really incredible. So, we need to think a little bit more carefully about what we characterize as wet versus dry site. There's probably some deep spring or something coming out of this hillside that this tree has actually been excavating and finding. And another interesting thing, which was completely unexpected, was this freak out, massive nighttime transpiration, nighttime water loss that we think is due to smoke from wildfires. This is September of last year. And what was going on here? You can see that before the beginning here, at the beginning of September, you have this typical end of season patterns. And then they just start freaking out. And the wet site trees, and all of the trees, but particularly the wet site trees, are losing water 24 hours a day at really high rates. Like, what's going on? We've never seen this before. Well, this is right when the KMP complex fire started down in Sequoia Kings Canyon. This is a map from the Paradise and Colony Fire, which were started here. Giant Forest is right here. Or right in this area. This was this is on September 11th, so right at that point, these fires were very small. And then by the 18th, they merged. Here's giant forest right there. They merged into this big fire and produced massive amounts of smoke. The fire didn't actually get into where our study trees are at in giant forest, but the smoke, we think, is causing this really unusual, novel response, which could, at the end of the dry summer period, when they're losing water that doesn't allow them the capacity to kind of recover overnight from daily water stress. They're losing massive amounts of water. We're still trying to understand the physiology and the mechanisms of why that is. It could be CO2, it could be carbon monoxide, some other particulates in the smoke. The temperatures were increased, some of the other variables like vapor pressure deficit, which we would associate with nighttime transpiration, were pretty mild. Light levels were low. So this could be a potentially really significant impact, and we're still trying to understand what's going on with this and how that happened. But it could be a very important indirect effect of fires on the giant sequoia trees, even though they didn't get burned. So another aspect of the work that we're doing is working with the Park Service and USGS and an entomology professor from Colorado State University named Seth Davis and his crew, where we're trying to get a better understanding of the basic biology, ecology of these beetles that we're finding in the trees. And so we're installing some sticky traps up in the canopy. We're also collecting some branches from some trees and cutting them and bringing them down to do these branch incubations. So we go up there and cut these kind of small diameter, like 5 to 8 centimeter diameter branches to see if the beetles are attacking them. These are in trees that show signs of attack. We're cutting them up into these kind of bolts and bringing them back into the lab and putting them in these boxes to incubate them and collect whatever beetles might emerge from them. And Seth Davis, this is a photo from Seth Davis that he presented at the Giant Sequoia Lands Coalition meeting back in February. He's developing kind of this beetle life cycle of when they're emerging and when they're feeding, flight, overwintering. So he's developing this, although this was developed from last year, and there's some evidence that maybe there's some other things going on based off of some observations that his assistant, Nate Foote, has seen this year, that they're emerging earlier this year than they were last year. So there's some uncertainty about this life cycle, but he's working very hard at that and trying to figure that out. He's also doing some morphology and genotype analysis to try and get a better understanding of, is this the Phleosinus punctatus, which is what we thought it was, the western cedar bark beetle, or this rubicundulus? And there's some evidence based off of the genotype and some of the morphology that the trees that are being attacked, giant sequoia trees are actually being attacked by the rubicundulus, not the punctatus, which is what typically attacks incense cedars. So that's still under development. He's doing some DNA sequencing right now to nail that down, but it could be a different species. And one thing that Nate Foote has found is that fallen branches are really good beetle habitat. This is a photo from Mariposa Grove. You may be aware there was a big mono wind event last year in that grove, knocked down an enormous amount of trees, snapped whole trees from their trunks, tipped over even some monarch trees in Mariposa Grove, produced an enormous amount of fallen woody debris on the ground. And what he's seeing, like as of a month ago, was thousands of beetles flying through the air. And so there's some population level dynamics that are happening with the beetles. It's not just how vulnerable the trees are and their susceptibility due to drought and fire impacts, but maybe these beetles are just overwhelming the giant sequoia trees because there's just millions of them flying around and attacking these trees. So that's actually, it's a little bit encouraging though, because just to go back, because this is something we can do something about. The parks can go through and clear out some of this woody debris to help reduce the beetle populations as one mitigation measure. And surprisingly, we found actually some evidence of beetle attack in a healthy tree in Mariposa Grove last fall when we were collecting. This is one of our study trees. It looks normal and kind of healthy. It's on a ridge top. not a wet site. It doesn't show the typical pattern of foliage dieback from the top down, like we see in trees being attacked by beetles. We just went up to collect some samples, and then for our stable isotope study, and then went up into the lower crown to collect some branches for Nate for his incubation studies, and we saw some evidence. We cut some branches out and saw some evidence of beetle attack, and he found, this is actually a photo of a beetle that, and there were multiple beetles in these branches that we removed. So this is kind of alarming that we weren't expecting to see this at all, and we're going to be obviously monitoring the fate of this tree and how it responds over time, whether these beetles are able to attack it successfully or whether the tree is able to fend it off by pitching them out. But this is a new phenomenon, even more so than just the observation of beetles attacking any tree. And now I'm going to switch over, and Wendy's going to take over the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Anthony. I will try to speak up. If you have any issues hearing me, just let me know, and we can put the microphone out. So fire and low severity frequent fire is incredibly important for the health of giant sequoia forests. They rely on it for a couple of different reasons. For the mature trees, it helps reduce competition for water and resources. It reduces fuel loads throughout the forest. It also helps remove smaller trees that might allow fire to go up through those trees and then get into the giant sequoia canopies. And for giant sequoia regeneration, it's essential. Fire helps the cones open up and allows seeds to fall onto the forest floor after the forest floor has been kind of cleaned up by the fire and leaves and bark and other debris have been burned up. It creates a perfect spot for the tiny little giant sequoia seeds that are about the size of a fleck of oatmeal to land onto mineral soil. And ideally this would happen in the fall, and then snow would fall on top of the seeds, and that would create a perfect situation for the seeds to germinate and emerge in the spring as giant sequoia seedlings. So, these forests really rely on fire. But we didn't understand that, and so there's been about 100 years of suppressing fire in giant sequoia forests. It was really only reintroduced in the late 60s and early 70s. So we have a lot of work to do to get these forests back into good health. And so during that time, we've had, with climate change and increased temperatures, we've had some really severe large wildfires in the past few years that are now emerging as a new threat to these giant sequoia forests that didn't see this kind of fire in the past. And just to put this into context, over the last 100 years or so, this is just a figure that Kristen Shive shared. She's used to be with the Save the Redwoods League and now is with the Nature Conservancy, and this is one of the slides she shared at our meeting in February. And it just shows over the last 100 years the number of acres of giant sequoia forests that have burned. And you can see over on the left, that starts at 1921 and we go all the way to 2021. And you can see how effective our fire suppression has been. Not much of the giant sequoia forest burned during that time period until we get to 2015, and we see a real jump there. So fire is making its way back into these forests, but not necessarily in the way that we would like to see. So just to give you a sort of a sense of how many monarch giant sequoia trees have died in past fires. So they're back in the tree ring record in Mountain Home. There's a pretty severe fire event that's quite evident. That was in the year 1297, and that was during the medieval warm period. So temperatures were higher than average during that time period. We don't know how many trees died during that event, but it does show up very prominently in the tree ring record. And then fast forward to 1987, that's the next biggest fire that we're aware of. And that was the Pierce Fire, and that killed about 14 giant sequoia trees. And then 2015, we had the Rough Fire. That killed about 92 mature giant sequoia trees. And Anthony and I don't remember that fire all that fondly because that's when we were doing our Leaf to Landscape project, and we were trying to climb during those smoky conditions, and it was pretty hard to breathe. So the smoke from that event was pretty widespread. And then in 2017, there were two decent fires, the pier and railroad fires that killed, less than 100 mature trees. So since 1987, there's really been about less than 200 mature giant sequoia trees that have died as a result of fire. So it's a fairly uncommon occurrence throughout their history to be killed outright by fire because they're extremely resistant to fire. They have thick bark. Typically, when fire is coming through on a regular basis at low severity, that burns up all of the fuel load and things like that. So giant sequoias really, when they do have frequent fire that's not severe, they really benefit from that. But then we get to the 2020 Castle Fire, and that's where things kind of have changed. This is when we saw about 32.9% of the entire giant sequoia grove area burn in one fire. So, from some points of view, we did need to reintroduce fire, and there were some areas where it was beneficial. This map here shows the fire severity at the different groves across the landscape where the Castle Fire occurred. It was mostly in Sequoia National Park and Sequoia National Forest. And green is low severity, and then it goes to yellow and then to red, which is high severity. So there were some groves that actually received potentially beneficial fire, but there were also several groves that got quite a lot of severe fire. And in those areas where the fire actually burned within its perimeter, it actually killed 31 to 42% of large sequoias. And by large sequoias, we're talking about trees that were greater than 4 feet in diameter. So that is a huge number of trees. It's about 7,500 to 10,600 large sequoia trees that died in one fire, compared to less than 200 that occurred in the prior, century.
Can I ask one? How old is a tree like that, ballparking? 4 foot in diameter?
4 foot in diameter. I mean, it could be. It's hard to tell the age of these trees just by looking at them. So it could be, 5 to 1,000 years old, or older. It is hard to say. Obviously, these trees get up to 3,000 years old, but there's quite a wide range in that size class. So they would probably be on the smaller end, less than 1,000 years old. And so over the entire range of the entire giant sequoia range, 10 to 14% of all sequoia trees throughout the range died during that one fire. And I just want to draw your attention to the grove called Freeman Creek Grove. It's kind of right here. This is one of the groves that had quite a bit of severe fire. And this is a photo from Tony DiCaprio that shows what that severity looks like. And it's pretty catastrophic. There really was very little survival in areas like that. And that sort of impact for a grove like that, it could have impacts on the trees that survive by changing the microclimate. So there are a lot of unintended consequences from a big fire like that we're going to be looking closer at.
Excuse me, those in that previous image.
Do you mind holding to the end?
Well, you have to
Okay.
keep that image in mind.
Sure. What was your question?
Well, there's a lot of small trees still, and a few clearly larger ones, and I'm just wondering what species composition, and I assume those are giant sequoias, the large ones, but are those smaller giant sequoias?
It would be a mix of smaller giant sequoias, white fir, sugar pine, incense cedar, so it's a mix. The giant sequoias, grow in a mixed conifer forest generally, so there certainly would be other tree species beyond just giant sequoias that died in that area of the forest. Okay, and then 2021, we had the KMP complex and Wendy fires. They actually impacted a lot of different giant sequoia groves. It was not as severe in terms of the number of trees that died. About 6,000 acres of giant sequoia forest was impacted by the fire, and it killed about 2,200 to 3,600 large sequoia trees. So that's about 3 to 5% of all large sequoias. So I'll draw your attention this time up to the left-hand corner there. There's the large grove there, Redwood Mountain Grove, that had some areas of severe fire and then some other areas that may have been beneficial, but just to give you a sense of what that looked like in the more severe areas. This was a photo provided by the National Park System that shows an area that burned quite severely during that fire. So in the last 2 years alone, we have up to 19% of all mature giant sequoia trees that died in just 2 fires. So this is really a new emerging threat that is very concerning, and it just highlights the importance of reintroducing fire in a controlled way in the remaining areas that haven't burned recently. This is another slide that Kristen Shive shared, and it just gives you a sense of the severity of the fire during those different years, with dark green being, not much of a change at all, hard to detect the fire occurred at all. Light green is that low severity fire, the type of fire that we like to see. And then we get into the moderate, which is yellow, and then red is high severity. So you can see how we have increased the total acreage that has burned, which is, a silver lining from some of those fires. But the acreage that burned severely is quite troubling, and that's not really acceptable from our perspective. As a way to reintroduce fire, it needs to be done in a controlled way. So we really can't afford to lose, another 10-15% of mature giant sequoia trees every summer. So from the work that Kristen Shive did, they identified some of the variables that might have caused a tree to be more vulnerable to mortality from fire. And it's important to note that this was before the 2020 fire. Some of those dynamics may have changed a bit. As you saw that photo from Freeman Creek, there were all kinds of trees that died in that landscape, so they just were in the wrong spot. One of the variables is having a cap face, so like this tree right here, it's got this big burned cavity there, and that's an easy spot for fire to get started and to continue burning. The wood is exposed in there, so a tree like that would be more vulnerable to dying from fire. Trees that died also tended to have a less robust crown, so a smaller crown ratio, less foliage, that would make it harder for them to recover after a fire. They tended to be growing in locations that were lower elevation, and they had a higher percent of crown that was damaged. So at a certain point, if the majority of sequoia's crown is burned up, it's hard for them to regrow in the following year. So another thing that we're starting to notice, and another emerging threat to the giant sequoias, is regeneration failure. So this is a happy scene that you would often see at the end of in the next year after a moderate or low severity fire comes through. You would see a carpet of these giant sequoia seedlings. These ones are probably a couple of years old, but they seem to be healthy and vibrant and doing well. I believe this was taken at Atwell Grove. So the fire that happened there had been several years prior. But this is what you like to see after a fire. But unfortunately, after fires like the Castle Fire and the KMP complex and the Wendy fire, we're starting to see more landscapes like this, sort of the moon landscape, soil that has been very severely burned. It doesn't absorb water in the same way. The nutrients are no longer available. And we were here at Board Camp Grove, this was last summer, and there weren't that many seedlings there. And this is what a lot of those severely burned forests look like. So we were able to find a few seedlings here and there, but that's really not enough to help the entire forest regrow. You need a lot more seedlings per acre to have successful regeneration, and you need input year after year of new seedlings. So one of the reasons why we're concerned about the failure for regeneration is that the actual seed sources, the trees, the mature trees themselves, have been killed outright in a lot of instances, or their cones were burned up. So there won't be that source of seeds falling into the forest floor year after year, or when a beneficial fire comes through, when the opportunity is right. Also, a lot of seeds that did make it to the forest floor actually died because of heat or desiccation, so they weren't successful in their germination. So we've seen quite a bit of seeds sprinkled across the forest floor, but they actually weren't successful in germinating, unfortunately. So this is leading land managers to start to think about opportunities like going out and actually planting seedlings in locations that burn severely. So Sequoia and Kings National Park is actually contemplating planting seedlings at Board Camp. And so last summer we were part of a team that went and collected cones from Board Camp. There weren't very many mature seeds, mature cones to collect there, so we also collected at Garfield Grove, a nearby grove. And the park is currently going through the process of having a public comment period to determine if the project can move forward. But we're pretty confident that in some of these areas we aren't going to get sufficient regeneration to have giant sequoias growing in those areas. So it really may require human intervention to get those forests growing again. And another thing that we observed last year, we typically in a forest that had a fire that occurred the year before, you may find a lot of brown open cones up in the canopy. And that's because they've opened up in response to the fire so that the seeds will be there and ready to germinate. But in locations where there wasn't a recent fire, in at least 2 locations, we noticed that there was a young new cohort of cones. So that's what those bright green cones are there. So they're immature, the seeds are not necessarily viable yet. And then every other cone that we saw in the tree was a brown open cone. But there was no fire or anything that happened nearby. Typically when you're up in these trees, you'll see a range of cohorts. You'll see new immature cones to cones that could be 1 to 5 years old. And then you'll also see the open brown cones. And so this was the first time that we had observed something like this. We don't know if it was maybe the result of a heat wave that occurred in late June or early July, or if maybe smoke could induce that kind of impact. But it's something that we're starting to think about, and realizing that collecting cones when they're available may be a really important thing to do, just to preserve that genetic material, so that we have it on hand if we do need to do things like helping to plant out seedlings. So with all of these different novel issues that are very concerning, that are facing the giant sequoias, the National Park Service started the Giant Sequoia Lands Coalition, which Anthony mentioned, and we attended a meeting in February, and also many other people from around the state, including the president of the Calaveras Big Trees Association, Vita, was in attendance there. And basically, there's a steering committee that oversees this, and then there are three different parts. There's the learn part, which focuses mainly on research and monitoring. There's rally, which is focusing on education, partnership, and funding. And act, which is focused on resource and fire management mitigation. And our small nonprofit, the Marmot Society, we're focused mainly in the learn and rally parts, but any organization that wants to get involved is welcome and can be part of any or all of the different parts to try to deal with these novel issues that are facing the giant sequoias in a holistic way. So it's really great getting together with all these people who are so knowledgeable and passionate about giant sequoias and want to see them survive. So the coalition partners are land owners and land managers throughout the Sequoia range, including national parks, national forests, the Tule River Tribe, Calaveras Big Tree State Park, UC Berkeley Whitaker Forest, a number of different groups, including the Save the Redwoods League. And then their affiliate partners, such as our group, the Marmot Society, USGS, Sequoia Parks Conservancy, any organization that's interested in being involved is welcome to be an affiliate partner. And the approach that we are trying to use is using an adaptive management framework. So you go out into the forest and try something, and then monitor and learn from that and adapt from what you learn. So we're working to develop a network of monitoring and adaptive management projects so that we can track issues like fuel loading, fire-related mortality, seedling recruitment, the western cedar bark beetle attack, and just general grove health throughout the range. And for 2022, some of the main projects that are happening, the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, and UC Berkeley and others are going to be doing a post-fire sequoia mortality and sequoia seedling assessment to get a lay of the land and see how things look after those catastrophic fires. The National Park Service is establishing a general protocol to assess grove health and keeping track of large giant sequoia trees. There's the Fire and Water Project, which Anthony was just talking about, which is a collaboration with the Marmot Society and the National Park Service. There's the monitoring of the western cedar bark beetle, which our group is part of in collaboration with the National Park Service and Colorado State University. And then there's also the cone collections that will be ongoing as well, which our group is part of, in addition to a number of other groups. So those are some of the main activities that are happening. And when we all gathered and everyone put their heads together, they identified high priority sites to reduce the risk of high severity fire and potential loss of mature sequoia trees. And Calaveras Big Trees was identified as a very high priority site for this kind of work to take place because there has not been fire since 2015. So it would be good to get fire reintroduced to the forest here so that we can help protect the mature trees that are here. And this, just as an aside, this tree here is the Linnea tree in the South Calaveras Grove. And it was originally going to be included as one of our study trees for the Redwoods and Climate Change Initiative. And Anthony had the misfortune of climbing it, and it's heavily infested with ants. So we did not end up including it, but it's a beautiful tree. Just such, well, Calaveras is just such a special forest. So to just kind of summarize all the different points that we talked about today, as you all know, giant sequoias are incredibly tough and resilient. They grow and live in the same place for sometimes, more than 3,000 years. So they're obviously very resilient. They're able to fend off insects. They're able to survive fire, winter storms. They're just survivors, and they're inspiring trees that we want to have around. But in the face of climate change, we're starting to see these new and novel interactions that are threatening this resilience to these trees that we all know and love. And those include drought, fire, insects, and other factors that are now making their continued existence less certain. And all of this is pointing to how important it is for us to reintroduce fire into these landscapes where we've been suppressing it for such a long time. So we really need to try to get as much beneficial fire into these forests as we can so that we make them more resilient in the event that a severe wildfire comes through. And at the end of the day, none of this is really going to be all that effective if we don't address the root cause of climate change. Climate change is really what's driving a lot of these new and novel challenges to the giant sequoias. So we really need to address that if we want to have giant sequoias in the future. And we just wanted to acknowledge all of our different collaborators. We've mentioned them multiple times throughout the presentation, but the National Park Service has been amazing, and the USGS Geological Survey. We have volunteers who have come from around the country and even around the world to help us with our work. We would not be able to get it all done without them, so that's been amazing. And then there are multiple different organizations that we've gotten funding from, and we will actually be expanding our work into Merced Grove this year. So we're excited to be able to continue this work and appreciative for all the support that we've gotten. So thank you so much, and I'm sorry to cut off the questions early, but please, any questions you have, we would love to answer. So thank you so much.
The slide you put up with the trees transpiring when the smoke was really intense, what does that mean for the risk factor for the beetle or the stress of the tree?
That's a good question. Yeah, we're still trying to figure that out. The more water that they're going to be losing at night, there's no carbon benefit because there's no sunlight to drive photosynthesis, but they're losing water, so it's just a cost associated with that. And if that happens like we saw last September at the end of the dry summer period, that could really put severe water stress on the trees that they might not otherwise deal with, that could put them over critical thresholds of like triggering hydraulic failure. So it could make them more vulnerable to beetle attack. We're not certain yet.
Is that a murmur?
That is a murmur. Yeah.
I'm just curious about the plot that you said you set up in the South Grove.
Yep.
And have you been revisiting that? What's going on out there with that plot?
So it's a long-term monitoring plot, and our colleague Bob Van Pelt goes back out, I think every 5 years, to do mortality checks to see if any trees have died. Beyond the mortality checks, I don't think that there are plans to do work right now, but basically what we established was a baseline, so that should people want to go back and study the same trees that we did, that information would be there so that they could see how things have changed. Yeah.
Are you having success in regenerating fire to help the trees? Or are you getting pushback from that?
It's really challenging because the conditions need to be right. There's a lot of, there's air quality issues from the smoke. There's the risk of it getting out of control and burning out of the prescribed burn unit or burning hotter than they would want. If there's if you're in the middle of a drought and there's a heat wave, then the burn bosses are not going to want to start the fire because it could probably get out of control or burn hotter than they want. So there's a lot of constraints. Funding is personnel to be able to actually implement them is a huge constraint as well. There's liability if it gets out of control and burns into adjacent private property. There's a lot of constraints, and when there's a massive wildfire and all the firefighting resources are already allocated to other fires, then they don't want to start another fire. So it's really challenging. I know a lot of the Park Service, I'm sure here as well, would like to do more burning, but it's just really challenging to find those windows when they can actually make it happen and have the resources available to do that. That typically they would want to do it like in the fall, but now chances are there's going to be major wildfires at that time, so they're considering, well, maybe we should be burning in the spring or even in the winter. That's not necessarily when fires would naturally occur, but there's such an urgent need to get fire back on the landscape that starting to think a little bit of outside the box when they can make that happen.
Thank you.
What does it mean that the Sequoia Coalition has named Calaveras Big Trees on its short list of high priority sites? Does that mean the coalition is going to help us? Or is it just
the whole idea of the coalition is to try and generate support for what needs to happen throughout the whole range. And so, the coalition will lend its voice towards getting the resources, for example, to be able to implement that. Calaveras is one of the high priority sites. There's other ones throughout the range. But the idea is to help facilitate that and make that happen however they can. We're not involved in that aspect of it because that's not kind of our role, but certainly all of the other land managers, the national parks, the state park system are trying to make that happen because we're trying to think holistically about giant sequoias as a whole rather than individual, like I'm only responsible for my land management unit. There is what's it called, a Save the Sequoias bill that's been or about to be introduced in Congress to get some funding to make those types of things happen. And so lending the coalition as a unified voice to say, yes, we need this to happen and we want resources and funding to go towards these different projects to make them happen. So yes.
New information I got was down branches being kind of harboring bark fever. Is this just down trees that are newly down that were recently alive, or is it dead branches? And have you looked at, if it's dead branches, have you looked at, a lot of times they just mulch up old trees and branches that have come down in forest management. Has it shown up in really dead trees, or?
So these beetles, we've known for a long time that they do feed off of recently fallen branches. So the branch is no longer attached to the tree, but it's still green enough so that the beetle can eat the phloem. So we don't know exactly, how wet or dry a branch it can be for the beetle to infest it. So we've known that they do feed off of branches that have fallen to the ground recently. So it's not just completely dead, desiccated material, but the concern is that if more of that material builds up, it might provide more habitat for the beetles, and if the conditions are mild, then we might see an increase in the population.
One is when you talked about the nighttime water loss of giant sequoias, by any chance did you take a look at the other mixed conifers to see if they had that same response?
We have not been measuring making these same measurements in other trees. We are certainly interested in expanding out to other tree species because, you know, we love the giant sequoias, of course, but they don't make up that much of the entire landscape throughout the Sierras. So all the other tree species are important. So we do hope to study them in the future.
And my second question, when it comes to water absorption, and we do know that there's a bedrock below us, then do you feel instead of the taproot, there's lots of micro roots that are bringing in the water, or is the mycelium gathering the water and feeding shallower roots?
Yeah, I think, yeah, probably both. Yeah, I think they're probably finding some weathered bedrock cracks that they can put some of their fine roots into, and the mycelia and the fungi that are helping that process. They might be assisting with that. We really don't know, but that's what we're hoping to find out.
There's been quite a bit of work done through the Critical Zone Observatory. They have sites in different locations. One is in Sierras, and they have found that a lot of tree species use weathered bedrock as a source of water. It actually can hold quite a bit of water, so it can almost be like a sponge that the trees can use water from. So this is one component that we still need to collect water out of because it's a little hard to get to, but it could be a reservoir of water for these trees potentially.
With the research that you've done that I think is amazing on the bark beetle, and all of a sudden it's threatening giant sequoias, we have 11,000 burn piles in Calaveras big trees. Isn't that problematic in terms of the beetle and sort of adding to the danger of losing our giant sequoias?
Depending on, you know, what species those branches came from. If it's giant sequoia branches that are still relatively green, then that could be a problem. But, you know, as they dry out, that's not going to be a food source for those beetles anymore.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
In regards to, you mentioned the western cedar bark beetle, does this have the potential to have the effect that the pine bark beetle did as far as destruction?
Probably not, because they are a much smaller and weaker beetle than the bark beetles that are attacking like the pine trees. We think it's probably more of an opportunistic beetle. Normally, the giant sequoia trees would be able to defend themselves. These western cedar bark beetles are native. They're endemic to the forest. They just normally don't. They normally just attack kind of weakened incense cedar trees, not the giant sequoias. So there are some trees, giant sequoias, that can become vulnerable under drought and fire conditions to the beetle, that they normally would be able to fight them off. But it's probably not going to kill like the millions of trees like the pine bark beetles are having and attacking and overwhelming healthy like ponderosa pines or other pine trees. Yeah, it's still early to tell, but
We hope not.
we hope not. They're a much smaller, weaker beetle. They're kind of more opportunistic. Yeah.
See the same thing happen.
Yeah.
The geysers that come from the boreholes where you take the core and extract the water through your isotopic analyses that run for weeks or months, you said, on the lower part of the tree, is that simply transpirational water pressure that's coming out of that hole, or is a root pressure possibly involved because it's so low down? I don't know if there have been any studies of root pressure versus transpirational pull.
Yeah, we think it might be just water in the heartwood down low that's just kind of sitting. Gravity is just bringing it down to the lower part of the trunk, and there's this really wet pool of water in the center of these big trees that when you punch a hole into it with these borers, it's just a tiny little hole, but it's enough to connect into the heartwood And then it just kind of weeds out from there. So we think it's just a reservoir of water just sitting there in the bottom of the tree, and it becomes less so the higher you get in the trunk.
We don't really know if the trees have access to that water either. We cored a tree after it had already died, and its heartwood was still wet, you know. So we don't really know if they can access that water or not.
Yeah, the hydraulic connections between the active transpiring sapwood that's moving the water, the outer clear sapwood that still has the open conduits, the cells that are transporting water, versus the heartwood, which has been injected with all these tannins and resins and chemical compounds to make them more, rot resistant, which doesn't transport water anymore. How much hydraulic connection there is inside the tree, like Wendy was saying, that water can contribute to the transpiration stream, we don't know yet. But
And the percentage of heartwood would be greater lower down than
sure, yeah,
I mean,
yeah. It could be an important water reservoir that they tap into under drought conditions, but the hydraulic connectivity amongst the cells inside the tree is still unknown.
So, in your graphs relative to the stabilized isotopes and where the water's coming from, it looked like you were only going down like a meter. And is there...
In the soil?
Yeah.
Yes, and this summer we're going to be going down to 2 meters. And then we're also collecting groundwater, well water, spring water to represent the deeper soil layers. And like Wendy mentioned, we'd like to get some weathered bedrock, but that's extremely difficult to extract access and get the weathered bedrock water out of. But at least we're going down to 2 meters, which is, we're working with a USGS soil scientist that has been looking at the physical properties at different depths. And she's found that basically hitting bedrock and that weathered bedrock around, between 1.5 to 2 meters depth in most of the sites where she's been getting cores. So we're going to be collecting those going forward. Yeah.
I wonder if you have any comments at all about some of the thought and action of planting sequoias further north, especially in Oregon where I live.
Assisted migration. That's under discussion. Yeah, some groups are already doing that. The people are planting sequoias up in Portland and Seattle and southern Oregon coast redwoods as well. That's something under consideration. It's being started in kind of ad hoc basis. It may be necessary. I don't know. The thing though is, these ancient giant sequoia forests, which we all care about, are not going anywhere. It's going to take, even if you plant a sequoia up in the Pacific Northwest, it's not going to be a 2,000-year-old monarch for 2,000 years. So, none of us are going to be around, and that might help the species. I'm personally not concerned about giant sequoias as a species like going extinct. They're planted all around the world. They're doing well as long as they get enough water in many places. But what we're concerned about is these ancient, irreplaceable monarch forests that are, we can't do anything about unless we save them where they're at.
You have highlighted some of the risks of prescribed burns a little earlier. Is there any strategy looking at some combination of mechanical thinning plus prescribed burns, or something that might mitigate some of those risks but still give you the benefits you need?
That's definitely something that the parks are interested in knowing more about, because you can do mechanical thinning pretty much any time of the year. So that would give you a lot more opportunity to get in there and reduce some of the fuel load. In an ideal world, we would have all of the forests in good health and have frequent low severity fire, but since that's not the case, we may need to resort to things like mechanical thinning. So I don't think we have a good sense yet of the potential, impacts of that. But that's one of the things that we're hoping to study as another treatment type, to see how that impacts the trees. You would assume that it would free up more water and resources for other trees and reduce the fuel load. So as long as that's focused on, small trees and isn't tied in any way to trying to make a profit or something. Sometimes that can be the problem with thinning projects. You have to be careful to make sure that you're focused on the right tree types that don't really have a lot of monetary value, but that we need less of in the forest.
Yeah, and mechanical thinning can be effective at reducing fuel loads. It's not a substitute ecologically for fire. Fire is still needed in these forests, but it can go a long way towards helping reintroduce fire and creating a condition where you can actually reintroduce fire without really high risk of it burning up really severely. And Yosemite National Park is already doing some thinning in the Merced Grove, and they're going to be continuing to do some more in advance of prescribed fire, because that grove hasn't burned in many decades. I don't know exactly how long, but it's been a really long time since Merced Grove actually burned, and the density of trees is in there such that they don't feel comfortable reintroducing fire without doing some pre-treatment mechanically. So they're actually in the process of doing that right now. Any other questions? Great, well, thank you all.
Thank you so much. And a couple things before you leave. Please fill out your evaluation forms that are on your chairs. And also, we have the Dogwood Festival coming up on May 14th. And we have John Muir Laws is coming next weekend for a training you need to have signed up for in advance. And May 7th, we have another speaker coming in on giant sequoias and John Muir.
Make sure everybody fills out.
The evaluation cards, and Vina will stand by the door and collect them.
Yes, we will.
Thank you again.
We have these people back because of people liked so much their first report 2 years ago. So yes, your opinion does matter. I will read everything and collate it, etc.
Is the sign-up sheet for John Muir here?
This is a basis for
It's full. It's been full for weeks. It's.